Being home alone isn't for everyone, but for those of us who like the peace of having the house to ourselves, any opportunity is good for us. However, that night made me wish I would never again spend time without company. Leah and I have been married for 3 years, and her work takes her out of the city for a week every 2 months. We both have our routine. Leah loves to travel, while I enjoy staying at home. Perfect. With summer just around the corner, Leah had a lot of extra work to do, and it turned out that she was going to be away all summer. Like I said, I love having time to myself and enjoying solitude from time to time. But a whole summer felt a bit excessive, and it didn't sit well with me. It's not that I minded her having to leave, as I knew it was for work. I just didn't like the idea of us being away for so long, and of course, I didn't like the idea of being alone at home during that period either. To make me feel better, Leah surprised me with a beautiful German shepherd that I called Nala. She also brought me 3 bottles of wine from a place I had never heard of, and told me they were from a town in India. Well, that didn't change the fact that she had to go away for a couple of months, but it made it easier to count down the days until her return. Finally, the fateful day arrived, and although I wanted nothing more than to stay, I decided to take her to the airport. "I'm going to miss you, darling," I said, with a lump in my throat. "Me too," she replied. "But I'll be fine and Nala will keep me company," I continued. "Great, I just hope she doesn't take over my side of the bed," Leah joked, and we both laughed. Then I gave her a kiss and watched her disappear into the crowd. I returned home with Nala and took her for a walk, and then we went shopping. That night I returned home and took Nala for another walk before settling down for a quiet evening alone, and everything was going great, enjoying the second bottle of wine and watching TV when suddenly, pow, the light went out. There were no storms or construction sites nearby, so I had no idea what had caused the blackout. With my flashlight in hand, I decided to go to the basement to check the switch, and when I got there I realized that everything was normal, but the light didn't come back on. Nala was with me at the time, and suddenly I noticed that her fur stood on end, and she stood still, staring at a corner of the room, growling like a lioness. "What's wrong, Nala?" I said, trying to calm her down. At that moment I shone the flashlight, expecting to see a raccoon, a mouse, or something like that. But what was there was something very different. In that corner of the basement, there was a guy dressed in black with a mask in his hand. His eyes were wide open and his expression was grim. My heart stopped. I was completely paralyzed, seized by panic. The impression was so strong that I dropped the flashlight while Nala adopted a protective posture, ready to attack. Then the man looked at me, and as if it were a horror movie, he ran his thumb threateningly across his throat. That gesture said it all to me. I prepared to run, but I didn't get the chance. In an instant, he lunged at me, but just as he was about to attack, Nal jumped and knocked him down with one blow. What followed was chaos. While Nala was engaged in a fierce fight with the intruder, I started shouting for help and ran upstairs looking for my phone. But when I got to the living room, I found Nala lying on the sofa watching TV, as if nothing had happened and the lights were already on. The bewilderment was overwhelming, but then I jumped up with my heart in my mouth and saw Nala licking my face. What was that? I thought. It was all a nightmare, thank God, I said with relief. I patted Nala on the head and took her outside to do her business before going to sleep again. The next day I called Leah to tell her about it. "It was just a bad dream, love," she said. That day I had trouble sleeping, but I fell asleep after having another glass of wine. But maybe this one was stronger than the last one, because that night I woke up with a start, after dreaming that Nala had lunged at me and started biting my face to shreds while I was sleeping. My heart was beating a mile a minute and a layer of cold sweat was soaking my forehead. And although I tried to calm down, I couldn't help feeling that something wasn't right. At that moment, I turned to my left and looked at Nal, who was sleeping peacefully by my side. Why did I have these nightmares? I called Leah again, desperate to understand what was happening with that wine because I was sure it had something to do with it. There was no other explanation. It was the only thing out of the ordinary I had done in the last few nights. "How are you, love? How's your day going?" I asked, trying to sound cheerful, even though everything was weighing on me. "Good, missing you a lot," she replied, as expected. "Me too, but you know I had another one of those weird nightmares last night," I blurted out. "Yes, I remember you said you've been having them lately. Does it have anything to do with that wine you gave me? I don't know, I'm just saying. There's nothing weird about that wine, is there?" I asked, half joking. "What? Not at all, darling. Maybe you're just having a bit of cabin fever. Have you been outside?" I told her that I took Nal for a walk a couple of times a day, and that I went out for a drive, trying to claim that I wasn't trapped in a cabin like a hermit. "If you think it's the wine, maybe you should stop drinking it," she said. And I realized she was right. It's true. I only do it to count the days until you come back. "I want you to come back soon," I said sincerely. "Maybe you're just stressed about missing me," she said, and it made me smile. "You're the best. But I have to go, sweetheart. Talk to you later. I love you." Later that night, after another glass of wine, I suddenly woke up with the feeling that someone was on top of me. It was a guy with his hand on my neck trying to strangle me. And next to me, Nala lay still, unable to do anything. Terror took hold of me, and when I woke up, I was on the floor, soaked in sweat, and with Nala looking at me with a worried face. The nightmares had become increasingly intense over the last month, and I was beginning to feel like I was losing touch with reality. One night, I went to pour myself some more wine, but then Nal, a professional sniffer, approached the bottle and with one leap, knocked it over, breaking it into 1,000 pieces and spilling all the liquid. She seemed angry, barking at the broken bottle. "Nal, what have you done?" I shouted at her, but she wouldn't let me near the mess. No matter how hard I tried, she blocked my way. So I decided it was best to leave it and call a friend. Don't get me wrong, it's just that this friend worked in a wine cellar in the city, and I thought she could offer me information about whether there was anything unusual about the wine. I told her everything that was happening, and she came to my house, and when she saw the mess of wine spilled on the floor, she bent down to smell it carefully. When she straightened up, her expression changed. "You have to call the police," she said suddenly, and my heart sank. What came after that was such a shocking revelation that it completely turned my life upside down at that moment. It turned out that Leah had been cheating on me. Her summer job was just an excuse to be with her lover. But instead of having the courage to tell me the truth or simply asking me for a divorce, she decided to give me wine poisoned with a substance that would slowly kill me, destroying my mind before finally finishing me off. The revelation left me frozen. Nala, my loyal dog, had noticed that something wasn't right, and somehow she knew she had to protect me. God bless that furry hero. As you can imagine, Leah was arrested and charged with attempted murder, and now she will have to spend a long time in prison. It is definitely true what they say about never really getting to know someone, and I learned it the hard way. I want to start by saying that this really happened, so listen carefully. It was my first year of secondary school, and for some reason I already had a reputation as a problem child, so I had had more than one encounter with the school police. One day while I was at home watching TV with my little sister, the doorbell rang. Our parents were in the next town, attending the funeral of one of Dad's friends, and as I am the eldest of four, it was always my job to take care of things. I went to the door without worrying too much about who was there. I thought it might be the postman, some annoying lawyer, or maybe our neighbor coming to snoop around. Fortunately, I didn't open the door right away, as I sometimes did. Instead, I politely asked, "Who is it?" And the answer came in a deep voice that claimed to be a police officer. It was a guy, although I couldn't see much because our door didn't have a peephole. But there was something in his tone that made my hair stand on end. He was cold and distant, not the typical serious and demanding tone that men of the law tend to use. So I looked at my sister and told her to go up to the room where our younger brothers were and stay with them while I took care of the situation. because I wasn't at all convinced that it was really a policeman who was at our door. Meanwhile, the guy started asking about someone with a specific name, saying that the guy he was looking for lived there. I told him he was mistaken. "I don't know who the person you're looking for is, but nobody with that name lives here," I replied, trying to sound confident. Then he kept insisting, and that scared me a little. Everything here sounded like a red flag. The situation was escalating, and the fact that he was using a threatening tone made me even more nervous. The window next to the door had thick glass that made it difficult to see properly, and when I leaned out, I couldn't see anything clearly. As it was midday, everything seemed dark inside the house, and the feeling that something here was not right only grew inside me. This guy had crossed a line, and now he was in Big Brother protector mode. "Listen, I'm not an idiot. I'm with my sister, and neither of us is the person you're looking for, so why don't you just go away?" I said, trying to stay calm. The guy insisted again that he was a policeman, but his manner didn't feel genuine at all. He kept asking me to open the door so he could check it for himself, and threatened to call for backup and arrest me for resisting arrest. That threat made me hesitate. At that moment, I saw my sister peering around the top corner of the stairs with fear in her eyes. We were strictly forbidden to open the door to strangers if our parents weren't at home. But I needed to check if the man at my door really was a policeman. I didn't want to get arrested either. At home, we had a screen door, in addition to the main door that led to the entrance, and I thought that maybe opening it might not be so dangerous. So despite the alarms going off in my head, I decided to take a chance and open it. As I did so, I realized that the guy did look like a cop. He was in uniform, and his hand was near his gun, but something about him still didn't quite add up. I immediately opened the door. He started looking over my shoulder as if expecting someone else to show up, and that only increased my suspicions. "Is your sister here?" he asked. "Why do you care about my sister?" "I need to make sure she's really not the person I'm looking for, so let me come in and check." He kept looking behind me as if waiting to see Jessie, my sister, and that seemed too suspicious to me. He was wearing sunglasses that made it difficult to discern his expression, but I felt uncomfortable. I still felt that this guy, whether he was a cop or not, wasn't at our door for the reasons he was saying. I know it sounds crazy, but after watching loads of true crime shows with my mom, I just knew this guy couldn't be trusted. The man kept insisting more and more that I open the door to him, but there was no way I was going to do it. On the contrary, I closed the wooden door again and asked him to leave my house. In the end, the guy told me that the person he was looking for had lived in our house and he needed to come in to search the house. That was even crazier, and it made me think that the situation was getting dangerous. Something told me that it was best to lock the door and call my parents. I couldn't stay here talking to a stranger who had no business being in our house, while the feeling of threat still hung in the air. When the man insisted on wanting to come in, I told him that we had been living here for more than 2 years, and that the woman who lived here before was an old lady and had moved to another county. But that only made him more irritated. "Listen, young lady, you are interfering with a police matter. Open the door or I promise you'll be in serious trouble," he said in a threatening tone. But I was in rebellious mode and wasn't going to let a stranger into my house without a good reason, badge or no badge. "I'm not stupid. I know you need a court order to come in," I replied. Then he asked me where my parents were, and I told him they were at the supermarket. You could tell he already knew they weren't at home because he didn't seem surprised. "I want to talk to them about your behavior," he tried to scare me. But the truth is that my mother was scarier than he was. She wouldn't mess around with threats. If someone tried to scare her children, she'd surely make a scene that would leave them trembling, even if it meant putting her in a cell. "My parents are about to arrive and you'd better stay away from our door because I'm going to call the police, the real ones," I shouted at him, trying to get him to leave once and for all. It was then that the guy approached the mesh door and started waving it around forcefully like a madman. "I know they're not coming, so open the damn door already," he shouted. "Go to hell," I replied firmly, and slipped away to the top of the stairs. From where I was, I heard him keep pulling on the door, trying to open it. Jesse was there with me, about to have a panic attack, but after a few minutes, the guy just turned around and simply left, walking towards the neighbor's yard as if nothing had happened. At that moment, I realized something. I hadn't seen a single police car in our driveway. We lived in an area where you could see everything that happened, and there was no sign of a patrol car nearby. Almost immediately after he left, I called my parents, and within a couple of hours they were at home. I told them what had happened, and my mother was furious. "You shouldn't have opened the door. You should have called me immediately," she said. And she was right. I felt a bit stupid for not having done so. Meanwhile, I couldn't help but notice that the neighbors seemed to be more attentive to what we were doing since that day. And to top it all off, my parents decided that we needed a babysitter every time they left the house without us, which I didn't like at all. I am completely sure that the guy who came to our door was not a real policeman, and if I had let him in, we could have been in serious trouble. So folks, listen to this. Teach your children that a uniform does not always mean that someone is trustworthy. They should always ask for the badge number and check at the police station before letting someone into the house. And this is always done with a warrant. For the future, it wouldn't hurt to have a sturdy security door. You never know who might have to open the door one day. Since secondary school, I have always considered myself a bit of a nerd, although not in the classic sense. I'm not one of those who hide in the library with no friends or who always get straight A's. On the contrary, I was a fairly well-known football player at my school. I had lots of friends and an active social life. But despite everything, enjoying my studies and learning was something I really liked. Getting good grades and making my parents proud were important to me. And sometimes I'd rather stay at home to read or study than go out with my friends. So in a way, my mom said I was a perfect mix between the nerdy kid and the popular one. Fast forward a few years, and here I was, in my last year of high school. While most of my friends were partying and enjoying life, I spent most of my time in my room preparing for the SATs and getting involved in school activities and sports. My main focus was to secure a place at a good university, as I lived in a small town and knew I had to get out of there if I wanted to achieve something big. So studying became my only way out. My parents are doctors. They met during their residency and then started a family in this small town. They are the most renowned doctors in the area, and I also aspire to be a doctor like them. I had two younger sisters who, at 14 and 12, made everything a little more fun at home. In short, life was comfortable. We lived in a 2-story house, and although we weren't rich, we always had what we needed and never lived in want. As the school year progressed, I focused more and more on my studies, and everything else became a distraction. I knew that getting into medical school was complicated, and getting a scholarship was even more so. The people around me could tell that I was isolating myself. I hardly went out with my friends and spent very little time with my parents and sisters, something I missed. But circumstances required me to be 100% focused. It was then that I received the first grade. It was left in the school locker, which was crammed with books, supplies, and exams. I used to keep my sports equipment there, but I decided to take it all home because I focused only on my studies. The note was on top of the pile of books, so I opened it with a pencil and read, "How are your studies going?" I laughed to myself and threw it in the trash without thinking too much. I assumed it was one of my teammates joking with me. A week later, I found another note in the same place. It said, "You didn't reply to the last one, why not?" Great, now I have a secret admirer, or maybe even an admirer, I muttered to myself, playing down the matter and putting the note in my trouser pocket. However, a few days later, while walking our dog in the block at night, I felt that someone was following me. My dog is a Chihuahua, so he wasn't going to protect me from anyone. And although our city is quite safe, I felt uncomfortable and returned home faster. The next day, when I woke up, I heard my parents talking in the kitchen. Normally, they always kept their voices down so as not to wake my sisters, but today, they were almost shouting. I had never heard them in that tone before, so I knew something was wrong. The atmosphere in the house changed immediately, filling me with unease, and I had the feeling that everything I had been ignoring was rapidly approaching a reality that I never wanted to face. I went downstairs, and the first thing I noticed was the look of terror on my mom's face. She was on the verge of panic, and my dad, on the other side of the room, was in the middle of a phone call, shouting at someone. I was very confused, so I asked my mom what was going on, and she gestured towards our back door. When I went outside, I noticed that there were huge muddy footprints all over the patio, and none of us would have been walking around there recently, as it had rained and it was muddy. So I started thinking, who could those footprints belong to? At that moment, I was overcome with intense worry for my sisters, who used to play in the backyard all the time, and as soon as my dad finished the call, he explained that he had noticed the footprints when he went out to get the newspaper this morning. Someone had been walking through our house while we slept, and what was most alarming was that my little sister's room was right near that back door, and her window had been open all night, which means that person could have heard her very easily. Suddenly, everything fell into place. I understood why my parents were so tense and scared. My dad immediately called the police, but with no security cameras at home, the officers couldn't do much. I knew this affected him more than he wanted to show, so after that, he decided to install several cameras throughout the house, even in the hallways. A week later, on my way back from school, I had that same feeling that someone was following me. But this time it was daytime, so I stopped and looked around. I didn't see anyone suspicious, but even so, that chill on the back of my neck didn't go away. That feeling that someone was behind me was still there, and I couldn't ignore it. I calmly continued walking home, occasionally looking over my shoulder in case I saw someone. And when I finally arrived, I closed the front door, locked the back door, and secured all the windows on the ground floor. I was alone at home that day. My parents were at their offices and my sisters were at school. Normally, I would have freshened up and started studying, but that day I found myself looking out of the windows, trying to see if there was anyone outside. When I saw that an hour passed without incident, I finally decided to get down to studying. Normally, I like to sit and concentrate in one place for hours, listening to relaxing music while I study, so I settled down with headphones and immersed myself in the books. However, that night, when my parents and sisters finally came home, I took a break to talk to them. I didn't mention that I had felt someone following me on the road because I knew that if I did, they would only worry me more, and I didn't want to scare my sisters. That night was our family dinner, something we did on the third Friday of every month. My sisters were excited, and my parents were also looking forward to going out, while I, on the other hand, was overwhelmed with homework and studying. So for the first time in my life, I decided not to go with them to dinner. Instead, I asked them to bring me a cheeseburger and, if there were any leftovers, to bring them to me too. Once my family had left for dinner at around 8 p.m., I prepared some snacks, grabbed a bottle of water, and sat down at my desk, ready for another long night of studying. The atmosphere was calm, but I still felt a slight tingling in my back as if someone were watching from somewhere, and that feeling of insecurity that had begun to creep in did not go away. As I concentrated on my books, I couldn't help but feel that ominous feeling creeping up on me. What if someone really was spying on me? Would they dare to enter our house again? My desk is right in front of my bedroom door, so every time I sit down to study, I have the door wide open, and that night was no exception. I was completely immersed in my tasks, reviewing exams and taking notes. I knew that my parents and my sisters wouldn't be back until late, as they always stopped at their favorite ice cream shop after dinner. While I was deep in my books, I completely lost track of time until suddenly, I felt a tap on my shoulder that made me jump. I immediately took off my headphones and turned my head with a whip, only to meet the worried gaze of my mom. I let out a sharp breath when I realized it was her and not the intruder, and asked, "What's wrong, Mom?" But she just looked at me silently with eyes full of horror. Then she moved to the side, and that's when I saw it. On the floor behind me, there were muddy footprints. They were the same rubber boot prints that my dad had found on the porch a few days before. I was stunned. Dad had warned me about the broken lock, and those marks weren't just around the house. They were inside, too. The footprints stopped just behind my chair and then went back down the stairs, out the front door, as if the person who had left them had been visiting. What really scared me was realizing that while I was concentrating with the headphones on, someone had entered my house and stood right behind me, without me noticing at all. We had cameras installed just outside my room covering the hallway and stairs, and the videos they recorded left us all frozen. A guy in a huge raincoat approached our house, walking through our garden. That was why his boots were so dirty, because he went around the house twice, checking all the windows and back doors. When he found nothing open, he took an axe from his coat, broke the lock, and entered the house. Then he went up the stairs to my room and stood there staring, with the axe in his hand. For almost an hour. Yes, it's as terrifying as it sounds. But the most chilling thing is that in all that time, I didn't even notice him. After a while, he just laughed and left. The cops checked the footage, but couldn't find any clues, so my family and I lived in fear for the rest of the school year. In the end, I managed to get into Harvard, and my family moved with me. But even now, when I remember that incident, I am overcome with panic. We have no idea who that guy was or what his intention was, but it was certainly the most terrifying experience of our lives. When I was about 25 years old, my boyfriend and I decided to take a trip to St. Augustine, Florida. We both loved the old atmosphere and all the history surrounding the oldest city in the United States. It was the perfect place to disconnect from the modern routine, so we stayed in a rather nice hotel and spent our days exploring museums and enjoying all the charm the city had to offer. One day during our stay, my boyfriend told me he was going to the pool to swim. I told him to do whatever he wanted and have some fun, while I stayed behind to work on a project for my internship. At this point, I really regret not having accompanied him. After a while, I felt exhausted and decided to take a nap, as that project was getting on my nerves. So I sent a message to my boyfriend, making sure he knew I was going to sleep so he wouldn't come and interrupt me. In the end, I fell asleep for about an hour, but suddenly I woke up without really knowing why. It was as if I had woken up from a very deep sleep, and as I opened my eyes, I realized that I could hear strange breathing in the room. It was soft, but it felt so close that it made me feel uneasy. I quickly realized it wasn't the air conditioner because we had turned it off the night before. Paranoia began to creep in because I really didn't know where the sound was coming from, and I definitely didn't want to find out. So I decided to leave the room and ask security for help from the hallway. I explained to them that I had heard this breathing and that I had no idea where it was coming from. When they arrived, they began to inspect, and just at that moment, my boyfriend returned. To my surprise, we didn't find anyone, and security couldn't find anything strange either. My boyfriend and I assumed that maybe it was just the air conditioning, as we had heard other guests complaining about problems with the system that same afternoon. So somehow I decided to calm down and go back to sleep. A few hours later, it was my boyfriend who woke me up. At first I didn't understand why, but then I heard that breathing again. It was louder now, and this time I was convinced that it wasn't my mind playing tricks on me. But then my boyfriend, quite alerted, pointed out something we hadn't checked and that hadn't crossed our minds at any time: the vent in the room. When my boyfriend went over to shine his phone's light on the vent, what I saw was terrifying. Suddenly, he took a step back and let out a scream while I stood there rooted to the spot, paralyzed with fear and unable to believe my eyes. There was a face looking at us from inside the vent. Someone was there. Without thinking twice, we ran out and called the hotel reception. The manager, a nice guy, was very alarmed and called the police immediately, and they arrived within minutes. As they searched the room and checked the vent, they made a chilling discovery. Inside the closet, there was a small cutout of a door leading to hidden walls. This meant that someone could have crawled and hidden behind the walls without anyone noticing. In the end, they arrested a guy who turned out to be the hotel receptionist. It turns out that this man had been spying on the guests for months, including us. The hotel manager was very apologetic, and they even offered us a full refund for our stay, probably to avoid us suing them. But the scariest part was that the police found several photos of other guests asleep in their beds. The images were in the receptionist's house, and although there were no photos of me or my boyfriend, I felt terrible for those people who didn't even know what was happening to them. From that day on, my boyfriend and I promised that we would never stay in hotels again. We opted for Airbnb, although I knew it wasn't the safest option. But in my head, it was better than staying in a place like that. Now I'm always cautious about hidden cameras. I even check behind the shower curtain just in case. Paranoia always plays tricks on me, and although nothing has happened to me since then, the idea that someone might be watching me haunts me constantly. Hi, I'm Leo, and I'm 23 years old. I work in construction, and although I've had my fair share of weird experiences, nothing prepared me for what I experienced 5 weeks ago. Many people don't believe in ghosts, but I can tell you that I have had encounters with them, and I have no doubt that they are real. My situation is something of a curse. I can communicate with beings from another world, and although some consider it a gift, for me it is like a curse. Today I am going to tell you what happened, and I assure you that it is not a simple made-up story. I lost my parents at an early age, so getting used to living without them was just part of my life. During my adolescence, I stayed with my aunt and her husband, who used to drink too much. It was a difficult time, but when I turned 18, they threw me out and I had to make my own way in the world. I worked at whatever I could and eventually found a job as a construction worker. It was a normal afternoon, and I was exhausted after a long day. So I went home and lay down on the sofa, turned on the TV, and started watching The Simpsons. Suddenly, I heard a noise in the kitchen that sounded like plates, but I thought it was just my imagination. However, then I heard footsteps, and that activated all my instincts. At first I thought of a possible intruder, but I soon realized that it could be the sound of the movie, so I turned off the TV and stood in the dark, listening in silence. Just as I was about to turn the TV back on, I heard a loud bang. The kitchen window had been closed. At that moment, I thought that maybe there was an intruder or something more supernatural. I knew I had to be prepared, so in a way that might have seemed a little silly, I took out a cross with a sharp edge that I had kept hidden as protection, thinking it was just a decorative ornament. My heart pounding, I approached the kitchen and slowly opened the door. The kitchen was empty, but I instantly heard the TV turn on again, so I ran to the living room, only to discover that the TV was indeed working. I approached and began to hear a whisper behind me. Someone seemed to be calling my name. Then the TV channel started to change rapidly, until they stopped at a strange one showing a living room identical to mine. I could see myself leaning in front of the TV, and in the shadows, I saw a humanoid figure. That figure kept whispering my name, urging me to stop. Little by little, I turned towards the shadows, and there I saw her, a translucent female figure who appeared to be my mother. "Mom," I whispered fearfully. The figure slowly advanced towards me, but what I saw was terrifying. It had scars all over its body and horrible worms crawling all over it, feeding on it. It had no eyes, and its face was destroyed, with flesh hanging down and exposing bones. That thing looked at me and began to smile. Its smile widened more and more, opening an abnormally wide mouth. And inside its mouth there was something that left me frozen. It was full of snakes that coiled and entangled. At that moment, I realized that it was not my mother. It was an imposter, a disguised horror seeking to trap me in its deception. After my encounter with that hideous thing, I felt completely unbound. I grabbed my cross and stabbed it into the chest of that aberration, and its scream was so diabolical that it gave me more courage to continue attacking. I struck the spirit again and again until it finally fell to the ground. When its form began to disintegrate into shining particles, I thought the nightmare was over. But the moment I felt a chill run down my spine, I knew I was wrong. Before I could turn around, I felt two huge arms wrapping around me. I tried to free myself, and with all my strength, I stabbed my crucifix into one of the new creature's arms. It screamed as if its soul had been cut out, and when I turned around, I saw another entity. Its face was unrecognizable. It looked melted, with pieces of flesh dripping as if it had been put through a blender. It had burns all over its body and cut hands. When he tried to speak, all I could hear was a faint "why" that reminded me of my father's voice. At that moment, I realized it was just another trick. That creature was trying to fool me into believing that it was the soul of one of my parents. But I didn't fall for it. I was alert, and I knew it couldn't be. With all the fear and adrenaline coursing through my veins, I jumped on it and hit it with the cross. It growled, begging for forgiveness as I delivered the final blow, and its body dissolved into the air as the previous one had done. But the experience left me completely shaken. For days I acted paranoid. I couldn't sleep. I feared there were more of them lurking, so I decided to protect myself. I started burning incense and placed a pile around my house, making sure it was lit all the time. At first, everything seemed to be going well. For 3 days, I saw nothing unusual, but after that, the game started again. One afternoon, I heard a knock on the door. I looked through the peephole and saw my neighbor, a somewhat crazy and disheveled woman. Her hair was a white and gray mess, and her clothes were torn, and somehow she smelled of rotten fish. When I opened the door, she started complaining about the smell coming from my apartment. She looked inside just as I was about to explain that the incense was the cause. That's when she made a spasmodic gesture and ran out backwards as if she had seen a ghost. I wasn't surprised by her behavior. It was normal for her to behave strangely, but later a new knock on the door surprised me. This time there were 2 policemen. They started talking to me about a complaint made by my neighbor, and I was stunned. I knew that her mind wasn't right, so I tried to explain that it was all a misunderstanding. Then the cops leaned in, and I could tell they saw something I hadn't picked up on. Without warning, they burst into my house, threw me to the ground, and handcuffed me for no reason. They took me to the police station, where they started talking to me about wild accusations, saying that I had killed my parents, and even insinuating that I tried to dissolve my dad's body in acid. It was at that moment that I understood. Those creatures hadn't disappeared. My cross wasn't enough to destroy them, and now they were seeking revenge. The souls of my parents were back, but they weren't them. They were like shadows that could change shape, and they decided to disguise themselves as my parents to ruin me, but they didn't manage to fool me, so they chose to affect others, making me look like a madman. And that's exactly what they did. Now here I am, trapped in this horrible place full of madmen, and nobody believes me. I'm afraid, but not of these people, but of the ghosts that still haunt this asylum. There are so many lost souls fighting for revenge, and I have no idea how long I'll spend here. I just want them to believe me. I was alone in my house that day, and my parents didn't die because of me. Killing those ghosts is what I thought I had done, but everyone looks at me like I'm crazy. So here I am, asking for help. This has become a real nightmare. And with each passing day, my fear that those spirits will return intensifies. It's not just my mind playing tricks on me. There is something dark lurking. I have to get out of here before those shadows take the opportunity to catch me again. Almost everyone likes to be alone at home, right? Sometimes a little solitude is just what we need. My name is Jade, and honestly, I have never been excited about the idea of staying home alone, especially after what happened to me when I was only 8 years old. I have tried to adapt and look on the bright side, but no matter how hard I try, the nights always bring me back to that very scary moment. Let me tell you a little more about my story. My mom died giving birth to my little brother Joseph. This was in the 80s, at a time when we didn't have the internet to keep us connected. One night, the power went out just as she was about to have the baby. My dad tried to take her to the hospital, but things got complicated and my mom lost a lot of blood, so they managed to save Joseph, but my mom wasn't so lucky. This was devastating for my dad and me. After that tragic moment, everything turned to chaos. I lost my parents all at once, my mom during childbirth, and my dad, well, he hardly spent time with us anymore, and little by little he became a complete stranger. I started to miss classes, and for some strange reason I found myself taking more care of my little brother Joseph than my own father. My paternal grandmother came every day to help me while my dad would disappear for hours. He always came home smelling of alcohol, and sometimes he brought back the perfume of some woman. Whenever I could, I would ask my grandmother about my dad's mysterious outings, but she always acted as if she didn't know anything, but the truth was that she was trying to protect me from what was really going on. "Where is Dad going?" I would ask her. She would say, "He's going to your mom's grave to visit her. He misses her a lot." And I thought, why doesn't he take me? I miss her too. So I was in a sea of feelings, trying to understand that my mom was no longer with us, and on the day of the funeral, Dad seemed like a stranger. He wouldn't even look at me or give Joseph a hug. It was like he didn't exist. It was all a mess of negative emotions for me. With time, I understood that my dad was angry, resentful even, perhaps because he felt guilty for having brought my little brother Joseph into this world, who would now grow up without a mother. "Your father is in mourning. He wants you to understand what happened before he takes you to visit her," my grandmother used to say. But the truth is that I never understood what she meant by that. One day my dad was out longer than usual. I was woken by the sound of the phone at around 3 a.m., and my grandmother was the one who answered the house phone right away, so I crept out of the hallway trying to listen. When she hung up, she saw me and forced a smile. "Your dad needs to be picked up. Your brother Joseph is fast asleep. Can you play the big girl for a few minutes?" she said. "Why does he need you to go?" I asked, somewhat concerned. "He's an adult," I reminded her. She let out a nervous laugh and explained to me that adults sometimes make mistakes. "I just have to make sure he gets home safely," my grandmother said, trying to reassure me. Although I felt a little anxious about the idea of being left alone, at the same time, the idea of doing what a big girl does made me feel powerful. So despite my doubts, I accepted. My grandmother trusted me to take care of my little brother while she went out to look for my dad, and that was something I had to honor. Soon, my grandmother left and closed the door behind her. Feeling a little uneasy and fearful in the darkness, I decided to distract myself by putting a movie on in the living room. But as the minutes passed, uneasiness began to take hold of me, and I realized that the darkness could have its own secrets. The vibrant colors of the cartoons kept me occupied while I was alone in the house, trying not to think about what was happening with my father and how strange it was to be awake at such an hour, with my brother sleeping at the end of the hall. Everything seemed quiet until I heard a noise coming from Joseph's room. At first I thought that my grandmother had already arrived with my father, but that noise seemed very familiar to me. Carefully I tiptoed towards Joseph's room, and the humming sound grew louder. Suddenly I felt a chill and fear took hold of me. Then a strange feeling filled my stomach. It was as if something dark was approaching. When I reached the door, I realized that the humming sound was like the melody my mother used to hum to put me to sleep when I was little. My heart began to beat faster, so I entered carefully. But what I saw made my blood run cold. There was a woman dressed in a nightgown full of red spots, leaning over the cradle of my brother Joseph, singing to him softly. I got a little closer, and with a trembling voice I called out to her, "Mom?" She slowly turned towards me. I had never seen such a pale shadow. Her eyes were sunken into a face that, although it had her shape, looked nothing like her. "Jade, I'm your mom. I've been missing you so much. Come here," she murmured, as a disturbing smile played on her lips. A chill ran through my whole body. Although she looked like my mom and sounded like her, there was something about her that seemed horrifying. My mom had always been loving and comforting, but this thing in front of me filled me with a terrifying sensation. She approached me, reached out her hand and said, "Take my hand, Jade. You can be with me forever." I backed away immediately as fear overwhelmed me. I don't know if I acted on instinct or because I was really terrified, but I didn't respond. I just kept walking away. Her voice grew colder and she said, "Jade, come here," over and over again. It was then that I turned on my heels, ready to run, but I bumped into my grandmother, who was right behind me. She raised a rosary and began to murmur a prayer to ward off that evil specter. It all happened in an instant. Suddenly the figure disappeared, but I burst into tears in my grandmother's arms. "It was a demonic spirit," she explained. "I had heard it in the house before. Since your mom passed away, your dad started getting involved in witchcraft stuff, trying to contact her, and that opened the door to a demon." The house was blessed after that incident, and we never saw that evil specter again. Even so, the humming haunts me every time I'm alone at home at night. I don't know what's worse, losing my mom or that thing that disguised itself as her to make fun of me. Although my father has tried to get closer to me to improve our relationship, it is still a bit strained. On the other hand, my brother Joseph and my father have become closer. Sometimes it hurts, but I think that demon got stuck to my dad, since he was never able to get over my mom's death. This story happened to me a few years ago when I was still living in my parents' house in California. I recently inherited the house and thought it would be cool if my cousin moved in with my husband and me while he was at university. At the time, the three of us worked in a Lego store. I only had the morning shift while my cousin and my husband worked nights, so I was often home alone. One afternoon, while I was in the backyard loading things into the car, I noticed a brown van with no windows parked across the street. While I was loading things into the trunk, the guy in the van started making weird noises. I didn't know if I wanted to look at his face, but in the end I did, and all I saw was his black giant's cap. I guess he was just another weird guy, and I decided to ignore him. 2 hours later, when I left to go to a friend's house, the van was still there. I jumped in the car, and without thinking about it, I drove to his house. As I was driving, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw that the guy was following me. I made a couple of turns, but he kept following me. I tried to get to my father-in-law's house, and as I parked, I thought that if the guy tried anything, I could run to his house. When I stopped in front of my father-in-law's house, the truck passed slowly. I looked and saw that the man made a gesture as if he were pointing a gun at me and shouted "bang" at the top of his lungs. After that, he left. I had always been a bit scared being alone at home, and that experience didn't help at all. How crazy. The house was creepy, especially at night. I usually stayed in the kitchen, which was better lit. One night, while I was watching something on the computer, I suddenly heard a loud bang on the door. At first I was scared, but then I saw the time. It was around 11 p.m. I knew my cousin was coming home from work. So I decided to open the door, but there was no one there. I called his name, but no one answered. At that moment, I thought of calling him on his cell phone. "Hello, I'm on my way home," he replied. Just before I could say anything else, I heard tremendous banging on the door to the garage, and the knob began to shake. My heart raced, and I bolted the front door, then ran to my room. I couldn't believe what was happening. As that same night, I couldn't stop looking out the window, waiting to see something strange or hear a noise. My cousin tried to calm me down by telling me that he was there and that I had nothing to worry about. When the sun came up, he took me outside to talk to the police. As I tried to explain what had happened, I noticed the officers moving around the house. One of them stopped and opened the garage door, which we always kept closed. When I looked out, I saw that it was open. The officers drew their guns and went in, but they didn't find anything. They told me it was just some kids playing and that if I ever felt scared, to call immediately. A week later, while I was in the living room with my cousin and my husband, I looked out of the window and saw the guy in the baseball cap standing on the sidewalk looking at our house. As soon as he realized I was watching him, he gave me a horrible smile. I yelled at my husband to come out, but when he turned around, the guy was gone. My heart raced and anxiety took hold of me again. 3 days passed, and although I was nervous, I continued to ignore what I'd seen. I was baking cookies in the kitchen when I suddenly heard a knock on the sliding glass door. My body instantly froze. The lights in the backyard were off and I couldn't see if anyone was outside. Everything went silent for a moment, until someone knocked again. I didn't know what to do. Anxiety filled me and a series of questions went through my mind. Was it him again? Was it just the wind? I swallowed hard and slowly approached the door, trying to gather my courage. I heard quick footsteps from the door to the living room windows, knocking there too, and finally returning to the sliding door. It was one of those chilling moments when instinct screams at you that something is not right. In a burst of common sense, I grabbed my keys, ran to my car, locked myself in, and dialed 911. Soon after, we sold the house. I still find it hard to be alone even now that I live several states away.